Good morning, good afternoon. Welcome, everyone, to this Carnegie event. We're really excited. I'm really excited to be here with three of my colleagues to talk about what comes next in climate diplomacy with the COP conference starting next week. We are scattered all over the world already on our way on various journeys on our way to COP, but we wanted to look forward and see what we could expect out of this. And obviously, this COP is happening at a particularly interesting moment. Last week, the IPCC announced that there is no credible pathway remaining to 1.5, admitting what many of us had already come to recognize, that we are not going to stay within 1.5 degrees Celsius, shifting the conversation to some degree from mitigation to adaptation, and therefore from things that countries are doing themselves to, in many respects, to the support that other countries will need in order to adapt to the climate crisis. This is John Kerry's last COP as the senior climate person in the US government. There's an open question about who the next special presidential envoy might be or whether there will be one. Russia's war against Ukraine has caused massive distortions to energy prices and caused, in many ways, a shift in that we couldn't have foreseen in much more speed, and actually curious repercussions for the energy transition. And obviously, this is also Africa's first COP since 2016. And in many ways, the focus will be on the region of Africa and the Middle East itself. And Zainab, I wanted to turn to you first and ask, what do you see as how will we recognize this as an African COP? What do you expect to see in terms of what African countries will bring to the table next week, starting next week in Sharm?
Thank you very much, Dan. It's a pleasure to be here, everyone. Thank you for joining us. And I'm connecting from Oxford on my way to Sharm-al-Sheikh in Egypt. I think before getting into the details of what African countries are expecting or are going to bring to the table, a key point to consider is that there are so many commitments that have been made over the years, certainly last year at the COP26. And for African countries and indeed a lot of global South countries, there's going to be perhaps an emphasis on tracking progress on these commitments. Even the Egyptian presidency of COP27 has stated that one of its objectives is to try to move ahead with implementation of these various commitments. And I want to mention a few, maybe two or three. So the first is around the energy transition, moving away from fossil fuels. Last year, there was an announcement made by a number of countries, particularly in Europe, but also including the US, to phase out fossil fuels, the financing of fossil fuel projects abroad. This is it was one of the notable commitments at last year's COP. Certainly, the situation has now been complicated with the disruption of energy markets globally. So that's one thing that's definitely going to be on the table for a lot of African countries because they were affected by this decision to ban financing of fossil fuel projects abroad. A second one is the announcement on South Africa's Just Energy Transition Partnership, which was really one of the most notable things to come out of COP last year. And some progress has been made on that front. As you know, that JETP, as it's called, was meant to provide $8.5 billion of financing to support South Africa's phase out of its use of coal. And a strategic investment plan has been under development over the past couple of months. This strategic investment plan is meant to inform the way the financing is going to be allocated, the packaging of the financing, either as loans or concessional finance or even grants. So this is something that's going to be announced at Sharm-al-Sheikh. I think the final thing I want to mention is, as we know, the push to mobilize more climate finance, given the failure to provide $100 billion that was promised in Copenhagen. To that effect, we saw a number of different announcements, so by the UK presidency and the Canadian presidency, for example, of around, I think they were trying to mobilize around maybe $50 billion or so. And I've not heard anything since that announcement was made. So there's going to be an emphasis to track that. But very importantly, the Glasgow Financial Alliance for Net Zero was also announced last year to mobilize private capital. So this was a coalition of all of the major private sector entities, whether investment banks or hedge funds or private equity firms, to commit to decarbonization, to mobilize, I think, like $150 trillion worth of private assets. That has also kind of, not, well, we'll see where the progress on that is. So those are some of the commitments that I think that people would be very keen to track progress on.
Okay, so there will be a focus on past work and where we've gotten to in the years, either since Copenhagen or since Glasgow or other commitments that have been made in between. Amr, I wanted to turn to you and ask, how do you think the shift from mitigation to adaptation, how will that play out in a kind of Middle East and North Africa context? What do you expect to see new ideas put on the table?
Thank you so much, Dan. A pleasure to join all of you and our audience, of course, as well. Well, I mean, I need to take us all back to the impacts of the Russian war on Ukraine and how it has been having a disrupting impact on some of the plans which governments announced in the Middle East and North Africa throughout the last years. I mean, the Middle East has been impacted in a massive way by the Russian war in Ukraine, at least at two fronts. Number one, of course, energy prices, especially for the non-oil producing or non-oil exporting part of the Middle East, which is the majority of the countries. If you leave the Gulf region aside, everyone else is in a place of facing the huge spike in energy prices. And the second front then is the food insecurity, which has emerged in a dramatic way in the Middle East and North Africa following the outbreak of the Russian war in Ukraine. The Middle East is a net importer of food. In fact, in most of the sub-regions, in the Gulf gets 90% of its food from outside. The rest of the region gets 50 to 60% of its food from outside. And with the spike in food prices and energy prices for oil non-exporting countries, it has been putting a great deal of restraints, new restraints of governments' capacities. What we have been seeing in the last months has been a set of announcements, a set of plans for climate adaptation and mitigation from key countries in the region. But the implementation has been lagging behind for reasons pertaining to diminishing or diminished financial capabilities. Now, when you look at COP27, what we have to keep an eye on from a Middle East and North Africa perspective, similar to what Zainab was just saying, is the push which is expected from the global south in general, primarily at two fronts. The first one is the global financing, the commitment, the $100 billion, the pledges which never came through, and then adding to it a set of other mechanisms which are being suggested. Egypt is putting forward a suggested mechanism for loss and damage compensation, which in the totality of it, it goes in the direction of getting the developed world to commit seriously and to deliver financially for countries in the global south to be able to address some of the plans and get financial pledges to be able to do better with regard to adaptation and mitigation. The last point I would like to mention is, in a way, it's no longer only addressing loss and damage or addressing adaptation and mitigation from an energy perspective or the energy shift or the transition to clean energy. And Morocco has been leading the region in different ways in pushing for green technologies. The UAE, but the UAE has a financial surplus which enables it as a country to do so. So if you look at the sort of at the outer edges of the Middle East and North Africa, Morocco is one case, the UAE are a different case. But in between, what we're facing are not only the challenges financially and technologically of coming up with meaningful projects to address and push forward with regard to climate mitigation, but it's also to address the social vulnerability related to it. We have a huge burden on Middle Eastern and North African governments when it comes to communities which are in suffering, displaced communities, farmers in Tunisia, migrants everywhere in North Africa. We have different displaced communities and communities which are facing the impacts of climate change, and that component of social vulnerability needs to be addressed as well.
It'll be interesting to see how, given that next year's COP will also be in the region, in the UAE, it'll be interesting to see how what issues that have a focus on the region are sustained over the course of this year and next year's conversations, and also how much of the COP conversation takes place at the senior levels of government, and about commitments that governments are making. Part of the inputs that are needed are the ways in which the climate crisis is having repercussions on the ground in everyday in people's everyday lives, and how you put that on the negotiating table is a real challenge. Noah, one of the things you've written about recently is loss and damage, and in some sense, both adaptation and loss and damage conversations are about or implicate large financial transfers from the global north to the global south. And I wonder what you think about what the prospects are for that happening. I mean, in a very real way, as the crisis becomes more acute, the imperative for collective action by the world community becomes more urgent. And yet the fact of this requiring large financial transfers from countries that, yes, while wealthy, are also going through their own economic crises right now, partly thanks to the lingering effects of COVID, and partly thanks to Russia's war against Ukraine and the implications of that. Does that make cooperation less likely at precisely the moment where it's most urgent, or becoming more urgent?
Thanks, Dan. I think it does make cooperation on loss and damage or reparations for climate change less likely. As you said in the opener, one reason for all this talk of loss and damage is that so much climate damage is now unavoidable. It is perhaps underappreciated that climate change only begins to slow when greenhouse gas emissions reach net zero. And even if we miraculously get on a pathway to 1.5 degrees Celsius, that won't happen until the 2060s. And so that's why you have this increased talk of adaptation and increased talk of loss and damage funding, the euphemism for climate reparations. And developing countries expect money for loss and damage to come separately from mitigation and adaptation funding. There are already a few talk shops for this issue, like the Glasgow Dialogue set up last year and the Santiago Dialogue. But developing countries have two main goals in Sharm-al-Sheikh. The first is to get loss and damage properly on the COP agenda, on the formal agenda. So far, these talks have been more like a side event. Egypt has accepted a proposal from the G77 group of developing countries to make it a standing item. And the hope is that countries unanimously agree to add it to the agenda at the start of the conference. And second, despite the economic crisis that you mentioned, it's a difficult time with high inflation and slow growth for rich countries to commit to giving financing. But there's always something. Last COP, there was a pandemic. So developing countries hope that there can be an agreement to set up a financing facility. Even if not much money can arrive this year, and the 15 billion that has arrived for loss and damage so far from Denmark and Scotland is really a drop in the bucket when you're talking about damages in the billions. But developing countries want to get a finance facility established now and then push the details for that to COP28 next year in the UAE.
Zainab, can you give a sense? Nigeria is a country that you know well. You've had a book come out recently about Nigeria's management economic transition. How do you think a country like Nigeria is approaching? I want to drill down into kind of how does an individual country delegation approach an international negotiation like this? Obviously, a large oil producer, dependent in many ways on oil revenue, although progressively less so over the course of the last decade. How do you think they are thinking about what they're trying to get out of these negotiations?
Yes. So it's very interesting that, of course, a country like Nigeria is big. It's Africa's largest economy. It's the world's 7th largest oil producer. So it has specific needs. And indeed, last year, it was one of the two main developing countries alongside India to make a very prominent net zero commitment to achieve net zero by 2060. India's commitment was for 2070. So certainly a discussion around the transition from fossil fuels, particularly oil and gas, is very salient for Nigeria. But very importantly, the discussion around using gas as a transition fuel has been very, very crucial for Nigeria. In fact, Nigeria's leaders have written opinion pieces, they've done roadshows since last year, making the case for African countries to be able to use natural gas in their transition. And of course, the war in Ukraine has made that need for flexibility even more salient, because the very European countries that were very much against the use of natural gas in developing countries, have gone to African countries. And I'm thinking of the German chancellor in particular. He was in Senegal, which is another gas producing country, to negotiate a deal to get natural gas for use by Germany. Although a lot of these European countries sitting on the board of the World Bank are still blocking financing for the use of natural gas in African countries. So there's a bit of a disconnect there, and many African countries are getting quite angry on that front. And Nigeria is certainly one of those countries. But I think I want to zoom out a bit beyond Nigeria, because right now within African countries, the discussion is around how to put forward a common Africa position, particularly around the energy transition and around some kind of flexibility in the use of natural gas in particular to achieve objectives around electrification. As you know, Africa is the epicenter of energy poverty around the world, with around, I think, 600 million Africans lacking access to any form of energy, either for electrification, but also for clean cooking. So that has really been a priority. But also, thinking about financing, sustainable financing for African countries, so that the financing for adaptation, even when it is received, is not just packaged as loans. We've seen figures from the OECD, for example, that a lot of the climate financing that has eventually been disbursed has been packaged. I think 3/4 of it has been packaged as loans. And we have to remember that a lot of these countries are already under debt distress, right? So, those are some of the priorities for a country like Nigeria, but in a way, it also speaks to where a lot of African countries are currently.
Great. Noah, one of the things that happened in Glasgow is that the countries participating all called upon each other to update their 2030 goals, to update their national commitments, and very few of them have. And I guess my question to you is, do you think that updating those goals is something that we should continue to focus on? In some sense, like if you made a goal and nobody follows through on it, or if you make a rule and nobody obeys it, then you have to ask the question, is this the right rule? Is that what we should be looking for, or is there something else that will emerge?
I think it is concerning that so few countries updated their nationally determined contributions, but and there is still more to do in terms of promising to take climate action. If everyone upheld their pledges now, we'd probably head for about 2.4 degrees of warming, which is still far too much. But there is a shift now to implementation. This COP has been deemed the Africa COP, but it's also been deemed the implementation COP. And I don't think we'll get any new announcements as big as we did last year when India announced a net zero goal and China formalized one. And with Indonesia committing to net zero, all G20 countries except Mexico now have a net zero target. So it really is about implementation and what happens in national capitals between the COPs. I mean, since the last one, we've also seen center-left government come in Australia. Lula winning the Brazilian election just the other day could do more to save the Amazon than any deforestation pledge put forward in Sharm. So it is a lot about making good on past promises, whether that's the 100 billion finance pledge or the global methane pledge. It's a lot about doing homework.
And for both of you, do you think one of the things that gets mixed up in these conversations is a kind of justice-oriented conversation, which is who deserves compensation for damage already incurred, or who deserves support for an adaptation that is one that they wouldn't have chosen and that isn't traceable to their own behavior. There's a justice-oriented conversation there. And then there's a practical one, which is when you look at the world, where should we focus in terms of if we have a limited pool of investment, where do we invest first in terms of mitigating what we can of the remaining challenge? Is there value to trying to tease those apart in some sense? Or should we continue to kind of treat that as an all mixed up soup of conversation?
I would say that they're not as separate as they initially seem. I think part of the advocacies around climate justice, it is also around being practical around what is feasible. So, it is very clear that climate change is real. It is happening. And climate disasters are displacing and disrupting the lives of tens of millions of people. That is very clear. So there's an urgency to act, and you can see where people are coming from when they are very, very emotional, that they want to see action today. But in getting to the future that we all want, whether it's net zero by 2050 or whatever objective that we have set, we have to be very clear-eyed about what is feasible politically, what is feasible socially. Because in the case of Africa in particular, and this is quite salient there, in our drive to get to net zero by 2050, we shouldn't also sacrifice the development aspirations of the hundreds of millions of Africans, right? People absolutely have the legitimate right to want to increase their incomes, to pull themselves and their families and their households out of poverty, to reduce energy poverty, to stop deforestation. And deforestation is one that comes to mind, that in our drive to reach net zero, if we don't provide an intermediate fuel like LPG so that people can have clean cooking solutions, they're going to keep chopping forests down to use as firewood. So, those two are quite interconnected, that sometimes in thinking about getting to that end state, we're forgetting about what practical solutions are feasible. And therefore, that seems very unjust to some people.
I think that's right, Zainab. It's hard to know what to tackle first. Are we doing the climate reparations or spending money on solar farms or on a seawall? And then the justice issue, the debt part of it is very important. And I'll speak to Egypt because I know Amr is having connectivity issues. But in Egypt is one of the few countries that did update its climate target for 2030. And they say, Egypt says it's worried about things like water shortages and flooding in the Nile Delta. But it also points out that one reason it has been unable to invest in renewable energy, for example, is that its debt burden is so high, and that so much of its government budget goes to paying interest on that debt. And that's a justice issue as well that's linked up with the loss and damage debate and the debate about using special drawing rights and the IMF to give developing countries more fiscal space. So yeah, there's this feeling of playing whack-a-mole, or the poly crisis, to use the term of the day. And it's a difficult balancing act for sure.
I wonder how much you guys expect that the kind of, we talk about adaptation as if there's a way of kind of in an organized fashion trying to deal with the implications of climate change. But in fact, Zainab, to your point, the experience that tens of millions of people are having today, obviously in Pakistan, we all watched with horror recently, is not adaptation, but rather an increasingly persistent state of emergency. And I wonder whether you think there's space in the COPs present and future for increasing collaboration among countries on actually dealing with emergency response or some aspect of disaster response as being a platform for collaboration and sharing of best practices, and indeed of collective resources and capabilities, including hardware, special equipment that you might need to respond to the implications of climate exacerbated natural disasters.
That's a very I would say that's a very complex question, and I don't know if I'm really equipped to answer it. What I will say is, and we've seen this happen with the flooding in Pakistan. We're seeing it also with the flooding in Nigeria. So this happened a couple of weeks ago. About 2 million people were displaced, and more than half of Nigeria was flooded, actually. The way I see it is that as these climate disasters become more intense, as more people are affected, it's going to bring to the fore the collective global failure to act, number one, the global failure to mobilize the needed financing and resources and to allocate them effectively and equitably. But number three, and this is really my worry, that people are going to become more, maybe I'm not going to use the word radicalized, they're going to become more angry. And we've heard leaders both in Pakistan and Nigeria mention loss and damage and mention reparations. In Pakistan in particular, Pakistani intellectuals have been talking about climate reparations. And what I'm trying to say here is that as we're seeing more failure around these multilateral frameworks to come up with solutions and to coordinate and to collaborate, people are going to become angrier and they're going to start seeking radical solutions. So I think ultimately, success of these multilateral fora, particularly at COP, is very, very important and is in the interest of everyone. Sorry, it sounds like
No, that's
fear
good.
mongering, but that really is what we're seeing. That's the trend we're seeing.
It's a good call to action. And on that note, I guess with just a couple of minutes left in our time, I'd like to ask both of you. Zainab, you talked earlier about the commitment on South Africa's transition that country's made last year, and you know, I think my sense is that that's been a mixed picture so far in terms of doing what it needs to do. But if you could put one thing on the agenda for this year's COP that would be a kind of proof of concept or a pilot program or something that they should commit to test over the course of the next year, what would an idea be for something that leaders should engage that's outside the existing agenda? What would be a good pilot or a good test for next year that could maybe prove to people that climate diplomacy can deliver something?
Oh, that is very, very tough. I think I would say that again, initial ideas that have been put forward around mobilizing private capital, just finding ways of making that work, because there's so much private capital like lying dormant and funding all sorts of dodgy startups here and there that can be used, can be allocated to financing and investing in climate action. I think around that, thinking about the best mechanisms to mobilize that financing will deliver concrete results. It's really what I would like to see on the table.
Great. So some kind of experiment around mobilizing private capital for climate action. Amar, we're doing a closing round of some pilot program or project to put on the agenda for this year. I'll come to you last. Noah?
I wonder if we could do more with insurance, and especially parametric insurance. You talked about disaster response earlier, and the world is somewhat used to dealing with acute crises like a hurricane or a famine that happens in 1 year and then ends. But climate change also does this slow motion damage. We're not so used to how to deal with floods that happen every year over 20 years, or a part of the world that gradually becomes less suitable for agriculture over 20 years. And so with insurance or maybe more formalized mechanisms for getting aid to countries like Pakistan, not just in the 2 weeks after a flood where you can send $5 by texting a phone number you saw on the TV, but something more formal where you don't have to assess that a certain amount of damage happened, but if a flood reaches a certain height, maybe just talking about creating a pool of money that could be shared out to countries like that.
Okay, innovations in our insurance approach. Amar, do you have an idea for something leaders could put on the table as an innovation for this year's COP?
I hope my connection is stable enough and you guys can hear me. I have to confess I am in California, not in Egypt, so that no one blames Egypt for bad internet connectivity. I mean, that's on our side here, or on my side here, not on my side there. So, well, two ideas. One, similar to, I was able to hear some of the conversation you guys, the great conversation you guys were having. So,
oh no, we
change challenges and risks in a way which relate them to pre-existing risks is a key strategy forward. What climate change as posing an independent set of risks or challenges, and to ignore pre-existing risk. If you look at a country like Iraq, for example, Iraq faces food insecurity, Iraq faces drought, and climate change accelerates a great deal of the pre-existing risks. If you look at a place like Egypt, Tunisia, and Libya, we are facing challenges related to desertification and lack of and water scarcity. And climate change needs to be brought into the mix, and we have to measure correlations, but not by separating climate change. Second point to put forward, and I believe the Egyptian presidency is spending some time contemplating, or has spent some time contemplating how to do it, is to activate alliances across continents in the global south, so that we no longer have only the Middle East and North Africa speaking separately from Africa, or Africa separately from Asia and Latin America. We do need a more of a global south narrative to be put forward, and apparently Egypt has forward new suggestions pertaining to loss and damage, as Noah was referring in his first contribution.
Great. I think we're going to have to leave it there, and with a commitment to invest not only in climate action, but also in California broadband infrastructure. Thanks to my colleagues. Thanks to all of you who have joined us today. We will be giving updates from the Carnegie team on the ground over the course of the 2 weeks of COP, and we look forward to staying engaged with you as we move forward in this space. Thanks so much for joining us, and have a great afternoon or morning wherever you are.